happy to have with us some esteemed guests today. We're here to talk about real-time payments fraud, obviously a hot topic with scams and the proliferation of real-time payments. My name's Debbie Cobb. I'm the Vice President of Product Management for our transaction solutions here at FICO. I'm going to let my guests here introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Vic Soni. I'm with Wipro Consulting. I lead the practice for risk and regulatory compliance for North America.
Hi, I'm Manish Ande. I'm with Teradata, and my role is AI and industry executive, helping our financial customers.
Hi all, I'm Krish from Cognizant. I head the payments, risk and compliance, industry solutions globally. Happy to be here with this FICO conference with this wonderful people and a lot of knowledge and a lot of sharing of knowledge what is happening here. So absolutely delighted.
All right, well, thank you guys for joining us. So just to kind of get started, I just mentioned the proliferation of real-time payments, right? We're seeing volumes escalate. We've got different payment schemes in different regions. You've got Venmo, Zelle here in the US, you've now got FedNow, you've got Pix in Brazil, UPI in India, right? Do you see a trend where you expect that to continue to grow and overtake, volumes of other payments?
Yeah, so I'll go first, right?
Yeah.
So what we see is actually, so far, the major form of payment has been cards, right? We have seen like credit, debit, prepaid, so many virtual cards. And cards-based world has been like sizable, right? So far, if you look at the projection, it's like $63.5 trillion projection by 2027. Whereas real-time payment is like $500 billion. But if you look at the flip side, the growth percentage, right, is very high for real-time payment. It's like 21 point something, right, for next couple of years. Where card-based payment is growing around 8%. So which means it's a huge pace that real-time payment is coming up with, right? So I believe, I don't know, like what you guys see as well.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the real-time payments proliferation globally is exponential, as Chris mentioned. What I've observed is in the developing and more cash-enabled economies, the growth or the trajectory is higher. I mean, that's by nature, that's how technology has evolved. And the adaptation is of instant payments, real-time payments, and due to COVID, it has accelerated. Whereas I think in the more developed economies where card-based infrastructure is more established, the growth is probably not as much. Still, there is the proportion of payments going to instant payments is high. But not as much as developing economies is what I think. And the other important aspect is, although the volumes are higher, the transaction values of instant payments are still lower than the traditional payment methods, and that's because of the risks associated with it and the limits and the guardrails that the processors and rails have put in place.
Right, yeah. Vic, do you see the same?
Yeah, I think very similar observations where with the FedNow giving the backbone and Gen Z, especially in the US, Gen Z and millennials are the forefront of using these. It is predicted to be at a much higher pace growth at this point of time. So the predictions, some of the numbers were around 190 billion by 2030, and this growth is basically a 35% year-on-year increment. So definitely see a huge potential. Again, similar observations where transactions are smaller, but and the one thing to keep in mind is how do we avoid the real-time fraud? What do we do on the prevention side, given basically the real-time payment processing that goes on?
Yeah, so a great segue into, kind of now leading into the fraud discussion. I mean, first off, we've got all of these different, rails and mechanisms, or as I mentioned, right, Zelle, Venmo, FedNow, and they all have their unique requirements, their unique processing channels. How do you see that as even an initial hurdle from a processing and implementation and then leading into, managing fraud? Vic?
So the velocity and the volumes are very high at this point of time, and it's just increasing. So the bank will have to do a better job, the FI has to do a better job of risk identification, fraud identification, having controls in place. There's a lot of onus that's been placed onto the bank within the risk management, operations. There is just a lot of moving parts from a reputational risk perspective, risk appetite, how much a bank can lose, and all those basically are very, very growing at this point of time as well.
In terms of the diversity of the payment rails, one of the challenges that we'll see is the fragmentation of the data, right? Every payment rails has a different format, messaging, and data requirements. So that's one of the challenges banks and payment processors will have to deal with, is how do we bring together this data? So they'll have to put in some effort to harmonize this data, to be able to then leverage and analyze that data together, which will be a challenge otherwise to detect fraud, because you'll be looking at separate pieces of data and you wouldn't get that full picture that you need for a fraud detection perspective.
Yeah, anything to add?
So yes, I totally agree with that. See, detecting real-time payment fraud is a little different than your other rails. So you have your ACH rail or your cross-border rail or your RTGS rail. So far the fraud prevention techniques that has been there, they are actually tortured and challenged. Why? Because real-time payment brings in the factor that the volume is very high, the amount is very low, and the fraudsters can move the money through multiple hops within seconds. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to detect. And because the volumes are very high, all your systems in the ecosystem, right, your fraud prevention product that you have, or your payment hub that you have, or your integration channels, all of them are strained, right? So you have to find out the right balance to detect the fraud. And for real-time payment, there is no account takeover. So it's very difficult to identify that fraud is happening. And with the scam coming in, like APP fraud scams, there are multiple types, right? For real-time payment, they are also growing. So it's very difficult for the systems, the existing models that they are there, to predict and find a cure is a problem. So there are many ways that we see our customers are looking ahead or employing to fight the fraud specifically in real-time payment rail, right? There are some techniques that we see in the market.
Yeah, so leading on to that, right, you just mentioned, it kind of opens up a whole new host of challenges that these organizations have to use in combating the potential for fraud and scams, right, in real-time payments. So what do you see as sort of some of the key challenges aside from the data or lack of data? What kind of?
So in payments for real-time, there are, based on which country you are, like you named a few CSMs, like settlement, clearing and settlement mechanisms in the US. So for real-time rail in the US, there are like 4, right? So TCH RTP, FedNow has come, right, from FRB. Then you have Zelle from EWS. And then there is Venmo, right? But like in India, you have UPI. In UK, you have faster payment. So based on which country you are, there could be one or many rails, right? Now the problem, what happens is there are push and pull technique, right, for making a real-time payment. So either, for example, you can do a push payment for your credit transfers. Simple, I send money to you. But there are scenarios for pull payment as well. For example, say C2B scenarios, right, bill payment, or some mandate-based payments. It's very popular in APAC countries. So for these scenarios, the scam that is happening, there is an intersection of different scam types and your push or pull payment technique. So our analysis, we find out, for example, invoice scams, right? Or say, push payment scams, right? Impersonations. So these are all coming into picture heavily for real-time payment. So fighting them and clarifying, figuring out what type of scam is happening where, basically classifying is the main problem that's we see in the industry.
What about you? What do you see with your clients?
So specifically from a client, we see they still don't have the infrastructure in place. It's real time. The losses are increasing. And it's basically a fine line between the customer experience and customer friction in terms of how much basically interjection they would do in between. If you think about real-time payment, and if you are not able to process that in real time, you may start losing customers as well. And again, different like for WeChat, for Alipay, for Zelle, for Venmo, but essentially those are the same challenges that we see as well. And one of the crucial things that the bank find is that the end customer does not know in terms of, if they are liable, if once basically the transfer is executed, it's irrevocable. So then who is liable for the fraud? Is it the bank? Is it the customer? And then the bank basically has to deal with this from a regulatory compliance perspective, especially in the US and Canada with OCC, FRB, and also from a reputational risk as well. I was just working with my client last year, and then they had a similar issue, like it was all over in news. So then that was a bad reputational risk for them, and then they started losing customers. And this basically is a larger impact that the bank is worried about, other than the actually having the high fraud risk cross.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the liability. I know that's a hot topic. There's a lot of potential regulations. It was interesting to see in the UK who sort of championed and was the early adopters of faster payments is now saying, hey, wait, let's slow down. Can we have a few days, right? Because of all their losses on scams. Krish, do you see that kind of continue in terms of the challenges with the having these irrevocable payments and people maybe wanting to take a step back because if the banks are going to be liable, right? There's legislation now in California about elderly, and these different types of scams target different types of populations. So are banks being more sort of conservative in this because if they're going to be the ones responsible for reimbursing, these customers, and you mentioned the friction, right? How does education play into that?
So what I see based on our conversation with the clients, right? Based on which country they are under certain jurisdiction, right? It's like your PMIs or FMIs of that country, they drive the rules. So for example, in the US, you have to follow FRB, right? Whatever they say. And if I remember correctly from FRB, they have, for Fed now, they're saying there are 3-4 techniques that they are employing. For example, classification. FRB has said that there are 3-4 different ways you have to classify the payment for real-time payment fraud, right? Then they are allowing techniques like your limitations, network level limits or bank level limits based on what payment you are doing, push payment or pull payment, right? So, and they are creating blacklists, right? Specific for real-time payment blacklists. So similarly, if you go to Hong Kong, HKMA, they are allowing, specifically for APP scams, banks are supposed to give money back to the customer. So there are some guidelines, right? So these sort of rules are coming into picture, which is enforced by the PMIs to that ecosystem in that country. So this sort of things which banks are integrating with CSNs, they have to follow. That's what we are seeing, right? And it's like an ecosystem play, right? Stopping fraud in a real-time scenario is it's a challenge, right? For example, they are saying by 2027, 27% of the payments, EFT payments, are going to be real-time payment, which means the world is getting ready for this amount of scam and fraud in a short notice. So what they have to do, they have to have an ecosystem approach. They have to break down the data silos, right? Talk to each other, exchange information, and while exchanging the information, it has to be in a proper, methodical, segregated way. So classification of the data is very important. Creating a consortium is very important. Exchanging real-time data on what sort of scams and fraud is happening in that ecosystem and beyond is very important. That's what we see in most of our discussions that we have with the clients.
Manish, how about you?
One is the regulation bit that you mentioned, which is there. That's a way for governments to kind of enforce things. But even otherwise, I think Vic mentioned reputational risk. In the US, although there's no regulation, which is still being discussed in terms of the liability of the banks for real-time payments, it's a reputational risk aspect. And the friction part that you mentioned, from a reputational risk perspective, what banks are trying to do is the balance between the friction and the risk. And I think what they're observing is that it's okay to have some friction. And if you apply the 80-20 rule, 80% of the customers, I think, are okay with having some friction to get that security that they're looking from the banks in terms of protecting from fraud losses. And I mean, there's always the 20%, I think, that'll complain no matter what, right? Whether the speed of the payment is slow or you take a loss, then that's about what is your risk appetite? How are you trying to balance that? And the aspect, an example of an Australian bank employee, intervening in a transaction where a couple was trying to invest in kind of a front company, right? And therefore, there was some friction. I think initially the customers were not happy. They got a call, they asked more details about the company. The employee tried to explain about what she found out in her investigation about the company. Then they were asked to come into the branch and then had to kind of show them. Right. And then at the end, they were happy. So in the end, I think that earns the loyalty and the trust. And so, yeah, I think you have more loyal customers. So the friction is okay as long as you have the trust being built.
And that lines up with what we see. FICO did a survey a little while ago about consumer attitudes, right? And the old adage of don't add friction into the process. Mm-hmm. I think in general, you're right, that applies. But the interesting part was, people were okay with some level of friction if it meant protecting them and they felt that the bank was looking out for them to, stop these losses. Some people, especially with the romance scams, get very, very adamant, no, it's not happening to me, right? And then after the fact, and how that comes into play is certainly going to have an impact.
Yeah. The other point I would like to add to that whole thing is how you add friction matters. I think if you personalize the message, and that's where the intelligence that the bank needs to build, or in terms of how you're intervening, to be able to probably just give them more information as to why you think this is happening, rather than just saying, hey, we think this is a scam. And they're like, no, I'm doing it. Or just saying, are you sure you want to do this? They're like, yeah, we want to do this. So kind of giving to more information as to, we've seen this type of patterns related to scams, and probably providing more information on it would help.
Or just giving them information to think about rather than, hey, we see you're making a payment to so-and-so. Is this you? Well, yes, of course it is, right? But it's sort of like, hey, did you see this ad on social media? Or have you done business? Have you, met with them personally, right? What research do you have? And sort of leading them down the path of, but you're right, that
share your
that
intelligence with them.
Communication, I think matters a lot. So kind of bringing to that, how do you see that playing, the friction alongside the education aspect, right? About how banks are educating their customers against, scams taking place and what's going on in their markets. Vic, what do you see there?
Sure, great question. What we specifically see is the bank is developing emerging fraud scenarios. And those fraud scenarios are then basically being pushed down to the customers in terms of educating them. And initially I was working with the bank, and then they usually, old school, send a disclaimer or more of a mailer. That did not work out universally, sending it to basically all of their customers. So then we decided in terms of, based on the scenario, we would do a risk rank based scenario in terms of what's the impact, what's the likelihood of scenario, what's the residual risk, inherent risk, and all those scenarios. Then we basically had a very specific level of population who could be targeted. So then the message is very, very personalized to them. That went on by email, by text message. That was absolutely very much more responsive. And there was no hesitation between the customer basically having more education or having like a friction in place as well. The other one example is from a banking side, right? What they have been developing, right? Instead of just sending, hey, is it you who are actually doing the transaction, or put in your code, we all are familiar with that, right? Then some of these, if I'm sending, let's say Zelle or Venmo, right, in between. So similar, basically real-time payment the bank has been adopting. So if I'm basically putting somebody's email address or cell phone number through whom I can actually send a payment, they would basically on the other end confirm me saying that you are sending this payment to Debbie. Are you confirming this one? You really want to send this one? Once basically the money is sent, it is irrevocable. And then they also put in messages in more terms of like if they find urgency, or at the back end if they see that the pattern does not match of you sending the money, all of a sudden you want to send $2,500 on the first transaction, it's not going to work. There is a cool-off time. First you are able to send a smaller amount, then there is a build-up threshold.
Yeah.
Trish, how about you?
So I completely agree with these two gentlemen, right? So that's also what we see as well. Like confirmation of payee, that's also happening a lot. UK, and now I hear that SEPA region, they're also going to introduce that. make an API call, figure out if that pay is authentic and the amount. And this personalized analysis of the spend pattern, right? So if this guy is supposed to make that payment, are these people making this sort of amount and this sort of MTI-based payment, right? Like in a liquor shop, right? $50 every week. Does it make sense? So that behavioral pattern-based analysis has to be there, right? That's what we are seeing. Now, emerging payment countries, right? For example, India, right? UPI, I think you're touching upon. 168% growth in last 5 years, right? And that's a landmark, right? Now, these countries also, we see introduction of checking with the client while making the payment, is the payment authentic? This friction has been introduced. Even I'm based out of India, so I have an ICICI bank account. So I started making large amount of payment, immediately I get a call, automated call saying, are you making this payment? This is the amount, this is the payee and payer. And then I say, okay, then the payment goes, which is okay, and I feel safe, right? So that's how in major economies, I think Australia, UK, they've implemented this. Indian subcontinent, I see Hong Kong, which is also leading for real-time payments. By the way, real-time payment has been there in the world since 1920s. Japan was the first country who, but then after UK did, it became a lot popular, right? And then from that side, APAC side, Hong Kong was leading, then followed by UAE, and then Indonesia they have launched. So Hong Kong also there for each and every payment, which they think it's going to a scammer. They have a method for calling the individual for individual payments. So this sort of checking is already introduced, and with a little friction, people feel safer. So it's okay. So
I mean, the general email format doesn't work. I think we spoke about the hyper-personalization or just giving more intelligence. And the other thing is not just communicating or intervening at the time of the payment. It needs to happen maybe throughout the journey of the payment, because I think Chris mentioned add payee, you add the payee, and then probably even before that, right? Maybe you're exchanging money between two accounts, and then which will lead to a final payment. And as banks kind of understand the patterns, they know that this path is probably going to lead down to a fraudulent or a payment that will lead to a scam. So once they recognize that this pattern has started, I think that's when the communication and the education should start instead of the end when you click the payment.
Yeah, so both of you have kind of mentioned and touched on the strategies and tactics and verifying the beneficiary and such. What do you see in terms of some of the technologies that the banks are using? Is it sort of just trial and error, or are they leveraging AI ML solutions? I mean, obviously FICO has our own solution, but what do you see kind of in the market in terms of the sophistication level, I guess, on what banks are doing? Vig?
So primarily, as I mentioned, the emerging risk trends scenario is what the bank is actually gathering. So internally, the data they have, they are actually trying to make the most of it, having a more larger database. From a technology perspective, they are trying to implement basically the better technology, have a higher amount of data as well, readiness for AI and ML. At this point of time, they are working with a couple of partners. We are basically working with, as an example, with FICO, at a client to do a proof of concept based on the very specific niche segment of area of the credit that they basically give to small medium business customers, as an example. So those are some of the areas we do, but and then also largely they are been modernizing their infrastructure is another key. And then there are third-party vendors as well that they are working with right now. So they are basically doing all, but the fraud is on the rise at this point of time. Last basically 2023, the fraud loss numbers were 9+ billion. And one of the questions that Debbie touched upon earlier was, right, from a customer side. From a bank side, the banks are ready to go on a faster acquisition of the customers, not basically thinking about the fraud loss today at this point of time. They leave that to basically the risk management or the higher at the board level in terms of more for what the loss that the bank can have an appetite to absorb. So the other thing, from a data perspective, the bank is not ready. Most of the banks that we work with, which is basically small, medium-sized regional banks to large FBOs and LISIC and GSIP banks as well. So data is one of the key issues, right? And basically bringing ML and AI would be where they are not able to today have the structured and unstructured data to be absorbed and make the most level of information out of that. So, but the process and the trend has started. I think it's one of the examples that came up in this morning, right? So we have the similar, FICO platform implemented at a client side, So those are some of the romance scams, some of the, easier ones to basically pick out there. But every day we come across scenarios where there are new scenarios. The very recent ones that we come across, I came across at a bank side was voice phishing. So the voice basically is an ML tool that you can basically find online, and it just trains your voice. Once you basically train, you can have them basically sing a song in your voice, or you can say anything. So now that basically conversation call goes to the client or their immediate family members asking for immediate payment right now, ACH. So that's basically one of the scenarios of having a quick scam in. So those are not yet to be dealt with. And we're still trying to work, what would be a way around it. So we're trying to stay one step ahead. That's why you heard about hyper-personalization. So anything you do, you have to basically keep at least on toes, steps to step with basically what a fraudster would be thinking to execute their plan.
Manish, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points, right? One, what we are seeing, obviously leveraging the technology, data and analytics, right? A robust data and analytics approach that financial institutions have to take to kind of build a holistic customer monitoring approach rather than a product or a channel or transaction-centric approach, which obviously needs a good view of all of the data around that customer, all of the events around the customer. And that strategy and a platform, I would say, to support that kind of a monitoring, a holistic customer monitoring is one thing that we are saying. The second approach, which is very effective for scams and even fraud in general, is that signal-driven approach throughout the journey. And I know we have had a couple of conversations with FICO as well in terms of how things are in the industry is try to create intervention points along the journey, which means that there will be signals coming out of every interaction with the customer, and the decision you take at the end of the payment is a combination or an aggregation of all of these signals. And you could intervene at any point, right? I mean, you could detect there's an account takeover. You could stop there, or you think you're not 100% sure about account takeover, but the next step will give you more information. Kind of build that. Again, all of this is based on that data foundation. And lastly, AI ML will definitely play a role because the patterns of scams are complex, and that's one disadvantage. They're ever changing and evolving. And the last thing is there's no historical data because of the newness of this. And your traditional methods where you look at what happened in the past, try to predict that in the future, don't work. So newer technologies, like machine learning, will help build things like anomaly detection because you're not looking at history, but you're still constantly monitoring what's happening with the customer and see if something has gone, which is not in line with the behavior of the customer. So anomaly detection. That's one thing, and what we are seeing is network and graph analytics because scams happen in big networks. So just looking at the customer doesn't maybe work. So you probably have to look at all of the interactions with the customer and the whole network and a graph approach, things like that. So those are some of the things we're seeing in terms of the technology.
Okay. Yep, I think anomaly detection is definitely critically important, right? Because all of the traditional, metrics that we use to identify traditional third-party fraud, like is it a different device? Is it, unusual? Fall out the window when you're looking at scams because it is that person, right? And trying to assess the internal behavior of were they tricked into this or were they doing it, knowingly and wittingly is a bit of a nuanced, right? But you mentioned something important about, customer level detection and how important that is, right? There's nothing more frustrating than you look on the card side and you say, hey, I'm traveling, you declined my credit card, and now 10 minutes later I use my debit card and you decline me again. It's like, you're one bank, treat me as one customer. Krish, what do you see in terms of how folks are kind of trying to enable that from a customer perspective?
Right. So I'll just mention one point on what Manish was saying, right? So yesterday, I think there was one session in one of the breakouts was saying Gen AI is being leveraged for stopping fraud. At the same time, fraudsters are also using Gen AI to fighting that back. So we have to stay ahead of the curve. So some of the points he mentioned are definitely effective that we are also seeing with the banks. Solutions that we are seeing like B-lists, right? Behavioral list-based patterns, right? And rules and the models that are coming new, right? Or specifically for real-time payments, right? Which is different sort of way approach. Fanatics, right? Fanatics-based algorithms, right? Not just matching Krish against Krish, matching Krish KRISH or CHRISH, whatever, right? Fanatic-based matching is also coming in. I've seen some partners, especially around Middle East and that part of the world, utilizing those sort of solutions, right? So technology, definitely, more and more granular understanding, models for predicting, customer-specific or region-specific or, category, merchant category-specific fraud, that is also coming up, and simulations, right? And he's mentioned one very important point, because scenario is changing every moment, right? So whatever models and solutions that we are being put, right, it has to be highly configurable, customizable. It has to change, it has to adapt, maybe many times during the day, right? So the solutions and the technology which is coming into the picture to fight this thing is more and more, customizable, forward-looking, leveraging techniques, modern techniques, but also keeping in mind the false positives has to be low. So it shouldn't be like your point, right? You cannot be declining every customer.
Yes,
all the
yeah,
while,
you can
just to be
eliminate all
safe.
fraud if you just decline everything,
Absolutely.
right? But it doesn't really get anybody anywhere. We talked a little bit about pieces of the solution, but if you had sort of, a recommendation for the folks in the audience in terms of, best practice types of solutions and things that they need to be looking at, including to help solve this challenge, do you want to kind of summarize, Vic, what you would recommend?
Sure. One is the one I earlier mentioned was around the emerging fraud scams, right? From a technology perspective, you have to make sure that the bank has a robust, KYC transaction monitoring system. So that's basically the backbone to basically have the data. They additionally have a larger database, the data set, the data model in place to make sure that the data is collectible. I think one thing, that Manish and Krish mentioned is around the data playing a key important role, and then the scalability and then adaptability as well. So anything that is a good solution today may basically outdated in the next few days. So you have to keep it adaptive. You have to keep it more changing. Then one of the things that banks have been doing is obviously we talked about educating the customer, but internally as well there are certifications available for the bank's operations staff or the risk management staff for them to be on the top as well. Like Krish mentioned that it has to be implemented, or it will be changed within the next 24 hours. So the bank's cycle as well, as generally the banks takes much longer time to approve a policy and a framework. So all of those have been like much faster due to the requirement, and this is all coming again from the top down from the OCC and FRB as well. Last couple of points around that is. One of the things that Fed now has started off is a community. Anytime that you have basically a fraud within your organization, you report it to them. They have a transaction. So now that basically is passed on and pushed down to other same banks as well. In addition to that, what smaller banks or banks of their similar sized banks, they created a forum as well. And they are identifying basically a common theme among the fraud that they have been doing. So then if one bank has an issue, it's then aware basically for all the similar sized banks. So, the chief, fraud officers and compliance officers go basically and attend. So there are new of these forums that have been created as well, which absolutely helps as well. And then, lastly, the machine learning and AI plays a very important role. So that's the ever-changing. I think, technology is the way to go with that. So, if you have the infrastructure in place, other than all the soft things like policies and risk appetite, moving forward with that will be, the bringing in a third-party tool is absolutely very helpful. I've been trying with some banks to do on their own, but we can only do so much basically with the restriction of the data. Like like Krish mentioned about the behavior pattern, we were studying in terms of a certain people in this demographic, in this age, the transaction does not make sense. So then, let's basically flag those transactions. But that takes a long time. It's already old by the time we are basically coming out to a decision.